Welcome to Dickinson Museum Centre. This is the first, hopefully, of many video podcasts that we're sort of experimenting with. I suppose we should probably give a few minutes for people to be able to actually connect before we start the story. Does that make sense?
Sure thing.
Yeah, I thought I'd give a little introduction to what we're doing. Bob, the director of the museum, Robert Fuhrman, who's sat just to my right, I don't know if you can see him or not, but he's been doing some research on the history of Dickinson, and he came into my office and was telling me a story about some of the things he was researching, and I thought it was about Dickinson's first fatal shooting. So I thought it would make a really good idea to do that as a video podcast, because true crime podcasts seem to be quite the thing right now. So we're going to give this a shot. If people are interested in this kind of thing, sit down, grab a beer, and we'll find out about sort of Dickinson's history. I'm going to download this video. I've been told to talk a little bit more loudly, so I've been told to. I don't get that very often. Usually it's the other way around. I used to scare all the animals when I was a kid on nature walks. Professional. I'm going to download this afterwards, and we'll be able to post it to YouTube, something like that, so people will be able to see it. You'll also be able to stream it on our Facebook page, which is probably the best place to see it, because there's usually a column of comments on the right-hand side. So the way we're going to do this is, mostly you're going to be seeing Bob talking about the story, and I'm going to be monitoring the video feed on my computer, and if anyone types in any questions, that kind of thing, I'll be able to relay them to Bob. And every now and then I'll be asking Bob a few questions to explain different things, that kind of thing. So other than that, we're about 3 minutes in. Don't know if I need to say anything much else. Oh, if you didn't watch before, we did a little test video where I exerted my daily calorie count pumping the pedals on our player piano. So you can hear the player piano playing Tie Yellow Ribbon, which Bob was telling us about a few minutes ago. So that's really nice, and hopefully we'll do a few more videos of the player piano when we load more paper tunes into it, because it's one of the really nice things that we have here at the museum. So there's that little video as well you can watch again if you want to. So without further ado...
Denver, thanks very much. I just want to say that the glow that Denver is showing right now is a result of all the hard work you put in on the player piano, and I greatly appreciate that. As Denver said, this is our first True Crime Dickinson podcast. We have entitled this one Cowboy Shootout at McGillivray's Corner. We're going to find out where that is in town. It's probably an intersection that everybody I know has been through, and maybe you won't look at that intersection the same way again. But to start out with, I want to talk a little bit of background first, go over the dramatic personages who are involved in this, give a little background on them, and then we'll actually get to the incident itself and the aftermath. So Dickinson, it's founded in 1883. It's a railroad town. It's at the end of the line, so to speak, and then becomes a main thoroughfare point for the Northern Pacific Railroad. Coaling facilities, water facilities, and most importantly, roundhouse facilities are built here early on. And that type of development certainly boosts the quick development of the village itself. Actually, technically, I can't call it a village. I can only call it a town there. Village is actually a formal governmental unit, and that doesn't happen until 1899. But the 1880s is really considered, at least in the classic American historical context, as the end of the frontier. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner's essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, comes out, his contention being that the 1890 census shows that there isn't the main component remaining anymore for a true frontier in the United States, and that's massive amounts of free land. And that's what drives the development of North Dakota, South Dakota, and points west during this whole time of the 1880s, is the free land that's available for settlement for homesteading along the route of the Northern Pacific Railroad here in North Dakota. So we're going to be looking at a couple of people who came together violently one night in April of 1888. But I want to tell you a little bit about the two of them first. You notice that we call this our Cowboy shootout at McGillivray's Corners, and these two guys are cowboys, although you'll also hear them, for instance, occasionally referred to as ranchers or farmers. And really, all three of those labels do apply to these guys. They both have plots of land up in what's now Dunn County, and also do some work on ranches for other stockmen. So it's not really wrong to call them farmers or call them ranchers. It was not uncommon for cowboys, those who were working stock and handling cattle drives, to come into a town like Dickinson, which of course was a railhead and a point of shipment, particularly in the 1880s, but certainly longer than that, a major point of shipment for sending stock east. And
have we explained where Dickinson is?
yeah, where is Dickinson?
Yeah, where is Dickinson?
Well, we're about 99 miles west of Bismarck, which of course is the state capital. We are just getting to the edge, western edge of the state here, heading towards the Montana border and the Badlands and what have you. We are the what they call the western edge, which, you know, that's kind of a touristy type thing to say, but it's really true. Joel, our cameraman, laughs at that because he works for CVB here in town, and they do a terrific job, I gotta say, promoting what we do here at the museum. So the Cowboys here, I did find a really nice little insight into cowboys. One of our earliest settlers here was Dr. Victor Hugo Stickney, who had his nose into everything. He was one of those fellows, not only a doctor, which of course gave him a decent lifestyle and a chance to become so much of a bit of, I should say, of an entrepreneur, but he also was involved in politics and served as a school superintendent for a while. And if there was something big going on in Dickinson, he eventually became involved in it. But early on, when he's here, about 1883, 1884, he writes some letters back home to the east to his father. And one of them, he talks a real little bit about cowboys. And so I just want to share this quote from one of his letters to give you an idea of what his impression was of cowboys in North Dakota. This is a quote. The cattle are looked after by the inveterate cowboy, the terror of all peaceable members of society. The cowboy is a psychological curiosity and is noted the world over as being the best revolver shot, the finest horseman, the most enthusiastic swearer, and the worst man in a row that America produces. So what Dr. Stickney's telling us is something we see in the local papers, and then it comes down to us, I think, through popular culture in terms of movies and Zane Grey novels and what have you, is that, yeah, for time to time, you will find cowboys who might get a little rowdy. They might want to put a run on a town, which is a term I came across during this research. Our two cowboys in this story are named Frank Chase and Jasper Holtz. Sometimes it's spelled Holtz, and oftentimes he goes by his nickname, which is Jap, J-A-P, Jap Holtz. Chase is younger. He's born 1857, so at the time of our incident, he's about 28 years old. And Jasper is born in 1840, so he's 48 when this incident occurs, which is actually, I think, getting pretty long in the tooth for a cowboy at that time, although I wish I was 48 again, because I'd feel young.
I quite like the name Jasper Holtz because one of the, there's a dinosaur paleontologist called Tom Holtz. So I kind of imagine it being like one of his ancestors who lived out near Dickinson. Who knows, it might be the case.
Could well be.
I like to think so anyway.
Oh, well.
So I imagine Jasper Holtz is Tom Holtz. Right? That's the face.
I kind of just kind of Okay. Well, and that's a good thing that you can put a vision of Jasper's possible descendant in your mind, because that's one of the things that we really lack on a lot of our early history here, and that's iconographic representation of what we're talking about. And I do not have pictures of Frank Chase or Jasper Holtz, but certainly we do have some things that we'll share down the line here, some pictures of areas that are pertinent to the story and what have you. But I'll just say right here, anybody who's tuned in who is familiar with Jasper Holtz, the name, or Frank E. Chase, if you're descendants of them or what have you, and you might have some photographs of them, that's the kind of thing that local historians just salivate over. Which is probably not the picture I really wanted to put out there, but yeah, we do salivate over that type of thing. As so often is the case with this kind of research, we start out, or at least I do, seems to always work out this way. You start out with the thing that draws your attention. And this, of course, is the shooting event that we're going to be talking about. And then from there, we try to build a picture of who these people were. And we're very lucky in that the local newspaper here, the Dickinson Press, started publication in 1883. And several years of it, from 83 up to 1917, are available digitally at the through the Library of Congress, through what they call the Chronicling America project, and they are searchable. And so once I stumbled across this incident, they became a primary source to try to find a little bit of background on Frank Chase and Jasper Holtz. So I'd like to share just a few things I found out about them. Unfortunately, there's just not all the detail that we expect today. Today, it's so easy to find out more than you ever wanted to know about someone. But remember, we're talking back well over 100 years ago. And beyond things like the national census, which was done every 10 years, and the state census, which was done on the 5th year of the decades, oftentimes people might not enter into any official records at all during their lives. And certainly some of the types of people we'll talk about in this incident weren't necessarily the type who were using their real names, probably. So
was North Dakota a state at the time?
No, North Dakota doesn't become a state until '89. So we are talking about the Dakota Territory.
So this is a year before this. Well, the event happened.
Right. The event happens a year before statehood. But so we're talking the Dakota Territory era, which is interesting because there's things that kind of affect the legal side of this as well. After the shooting and such, and we'll touch on those as we move a little bit further forward. But I do have a few things to share that I was able to find out about Jasper and Frank prior to the incident in 1888, and I'll just go through a couple of those. The first one that we find any trace of is Jasper. Jasper Holtz and 2 companions make it into the Independent Record newspaper out of Helena, Montana, where the Dawson County Sheriff has put a $100 bounty on these 3 gentlemen because they had tried to, quote, run the town one evening.
So how much was the bounty?
$100.
So what's $100? What would that buy you in 18, whatever this was?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. And you know, I was thinking about, there's actually a website. There are several websites where you can convert, and I just forgot to do that.
Oh, okay.
Oops.
$100.
It is a considerable amount of money. For instance, during this time period, you might buy a town lot for $300 or $400 here, and if you've improved it, a modest house in lot might be $1,100 or $1,200.
So $100 is a tenth of a house.
Yeah.
So that's
yeah.
That's good.
You know,
That's pretty good.
Think of the houses that we all live in, and you know, my wife wouldn't bail me out for that.
So what did Jasper do? What does run the town mean?
That's a really good question, and that's a discussion that we actually had a little bit. And you know, I tried to look into slang dictionaries and such, and really didn't find a definite definition for it. But I think probably the best synonym I could have for it would be paint the town red. Obviously, they're doing something of at least a minor criminal nature, maybe some vandalism, probably some enthusiastic shooting, that type of thing that we see in old movies, old westerns and things like that. I've actually seen accounts of that, even in Dickinson. People shooting at the bartender's feet and things like that. So it's probably something along those lines. And interestingly enough, that they got out of town pretty quickly, so they knew that there was going to be repercussions for it. And never do we find any trace when we do a search of regional newspapers that Holtz was hauled in and paid his fine or what have you.
We had somebody message, and they looked on one of the websites, and they said $100 in 1889. This was
real close.
Is $2,880 in 2019.
Thank you. Whoever that was, greatly appreciate that.
So about $3,000.
About $3,000. Yeah. I'd be sitting.
I'd shop him.
Yeah. I'd be sitting in jail for that. Yeah. I wouldn't be able to pay the fine. So fairly. So they were pretty rambunctious, and they were pretty serious, obviously, in Helena, Montana, to try to keep a lid on that type of thing. Some other traces we have of these guys prior, 1884, Frank Chase actually visits Dickinson. He has a ranch up in the Killdeer Mountain area, and mentions in March of 1884, when he comes to Dickinson to visit, that the stock up in the Killdeer Mountain area is in pretty good shape. And this is very typical. I know it sounds like a really weird little item to show up in the newspaper, but it's pretty typical when people come to town. They might stop in at the press office, or the press editor may go walking around the streets of Dickinson looking for people who were just coming into town and ask them what the news is in their area. So I get this picture of an early press editor walking around with a stub of a pencil, taking a couple of notes, and he runs into Frank Chase that day, and Frank says, our stock up in the Killdeer Mountain area is looking pretty good. And that makes it into the newspaper. So, but at least it tells us that Frank comes down here quite a bit. 1885, Chase visits again, this time with a guy named James Cuskelly. The Cuskelly family, I think it's 3 brothers, are early settlers in Dickinson, and eventually, after they sold their saloon. I don't remember who they sold it to, but they move on up.
Was it a saloon in Dickinson?
Yes, yeah, they had a saloon in Dickinson, and of course, Cuskelly's, they were involved with the early Catholic Church, which was St. Peter's here. They're Irishmen. They move up to Dunn County on a ranch, but they're back and forth into Dickinson quite often. So Chase is obviously a friend of Cuskelly. They come down to town in January of '85 with a rather large load of venison. And this was something that wasn't uncommon either for fellows who were going up into the Killdeer Mountains to go hunting and then bring meat into town and sell it. Other things that we came across, the 1885 Dakota Territorial Census, we did find Jasper Holtz and his Irish-born wife, Kate, in Dunn County. That's where we got his age. He's 45 and 85, living in the Killdeer Mountain area. And that's really kind of the background we've got on those guys separately. I'm going to go back one year to 1884, which is the first time that we find trace of these two guys operating together. This is a time period when we first start to run into, as I said, we ran into the first mention of them together, but it's also a time period where the vigilante movement is in full swing. A lady named Zema Trinka wrote a book in 1920 called Out Where the West Begins, and includes in it a chapter on vigilantes in North Dakota. She attributes the vigilante movement ostensibly to the desire to rid the frontier of cattle rustlers and horse thieves. And this is one of those themes, again, that shows up in Westerns and what have you from the time period. But this was a real thing. These vigilante committees, basically laws in and of themselves, would go out and supposedly run off, or more often times lynch or otherwise kill horse thieves and rustlers.
So who'd organise them? I mean, do they just like get together in the town, or?
Well, you know, it's that kind of thing you'd figure you'd do on a Saturday night, but actually they're typically were organized by stockmen's associations. So a lot of major stockmen would get together and say, you know, we're seeing a lot of trouble in our area with cattle rustling. We need to basically put together a posse to go out, patrol the area, look for these guys, and deal with them. And we're talking about dealing with them in rough frontier justice.
So they weren't. I mean, vigilantes suggest that, you know, they are vigilantes, but
They are extra legal.
They weren't authorised by the sheriff or anything. It was literally ranchers and stockmen who just
exactly
had enough.
Right. They'd had enough. But as I said, Zima Trinka in her book talks about that. That's their goal to rid the area of rustlers and horse thieves. That's ostensibly their goal. What she contends, especially in a vigilante committee that was formed in eastern Montana and patrolled into western North Dakota, she contends that they were really there to bully small ranchers to get them to vacate the area, to keep the range open for the large stockmen's herds to have free range. Now, that appears to be what our fellows ran into in 1885. Chase and Jasper Holtz are working on the Schaefer Ranch, which is in Dunn County. No, I'm sorry, it's McKenzie County, which is just west, if I'm remembering correctly, of Dunn County. The Schaefer Ranch.
So how far is that from here?
No, you're asking.
Roughly.
I felt pretty good. I was able to find Schaefer on the map, and I
couldn't even remember the name of the road through town. So that's okay.
Okay, I appreciate that. Well, you know, it's about where they're located, where their ranches are located, and I feel that I get the feeling that their ranches are small operations and that they're working on the Schaefer Ranch for extra money. They talk about their ranches being about 50 miles away, as the crow flies. But, so they're working on the Schaefer Ranch, and incidentally, the Schaefer Ranch is owned by Mr. Schaefer, and he eventually has a son who becomes governor of North Dakota down the line. Actually grows up in the Dickinson area. They come down nearly around, even though he holds on to his ranch, like a lot of people do. A lot of people move into Dickinson, but still hold their ranch out in the country. Pretty standard thing to do. But I digress, which will happen from time to time tonight, I'm sure. But anyway, so this vigilante committee is out patrolling, and during this patrol, they supposedly run off a couple of small ranchers. They actually kill a hunter and run into our two friends here.
Did they kill any cattle rustlers, or was it just ranchers and runters?
Well, anybody who would ask them, the hunter that they killed, they would have said he was a rustler. But there's Zinka in her book contends there's no evidence to that effect. So, oops. But they run into our fellows at the Schaefer Ranch. They're working out on the Schaefer Range, I should say, and they're also have a companion with them, and I love this. This is a cowboy named Kid Edgar. You know, it's, you know, you think of all these tough cowboy names like Billy the Kid and that type of thing, and here we have Kid Edgar. Just kind of strikes me like he should wear wire rimmed glasses or something. I'm not sure, but so these three guys are out working the range, you know, taking care of the Schaefer Ranch's cattle and what have you. And this group of riders comes up to them, and they're like, "Hi, how you doing?" This, that, and the other thing, and they naively invite them to eat with them. And so this is about 15 guys, I guess, 15 or 20 people in this vigilante posse or vigilante committee. They eat with Jasper and Frank and Kid Edgar, and after they finish eating, they announce that, well, now we're going to hang you because you're obviously rustlers. And they're in pretty dire straits for a moment or so, but what happens, and I'm going to take a quote from Zima right now. She says, "The situation was critical, but they were saved by Frank Chase, a brilliant speaker, a striking personality, and a man of wonderful ingenuity. Chase fed the riders a story claiming to be a big stockman himself, and he actually takes them out and shows them some herds in the area and says, oh yeah, those are mine, and those over there are mine, and these are the plans I have for my herds, and these are my stock plans. I'm really with you guys." And they buy it. And eventually, they're like, well, thanks for dinner. Good to know that you're in favor of the big stockman. We're going to count you on our side. We'll see you around. And they ride off.
But if they were legitimately working on the Schaefer Ranch, couldn't they just say, "But we legitimately work here as cowboys. Let's go see Mr. Schaefer"?
But that's the thing, is they're not at the ranch itself. They're out on the range that's associated with the ranch.
Yeah, but you'd be a bit annoyed if your cowboys didn't come back to the ranch with the cows that day, and you're like, "Where's that Chase guy? I told him to move them from that area to that area," and you find him swinging from the tree.
You have to remember that cowboys don't come home every night.
Okay.
Yeah. You should really listen to that. What's the James Taylor song? Sweet Baby James? Oh, come on, it's a cowboy song. Oh, man. You guys are young. Anyway, I digress. Again. Years later, Kid Edgar commented, and I think this was probably when he was interviewed for Zema Trinka's book. He said, "I was never so sure of anything in my life as that we would be hanged from that cottonwood tree, but Chase lied out of it." So it gives us this little bit of insight, which I never expected to find about Frank Chase. And also it gave me a chance to learn a little bit more about the whole vigilante thing, which really, I guess I really thought of it as more of a Hollywood type trope as opposed to this real blood and guts type thing that was happening out in Montana and North Dakota.
They sound worse. I mean, if you got some legitimate cowboys and they we're going to hang you, it's like,
oops.
Well, you just sort of feel like, well, how did they decide? If they come across anybody at all, it's like,
yeah.
I digress, but it just strikes me as like they don't have any criteria for deciding somebody's broken the law other than we came across them near some cows.
I guess, they'd be able to come back and say, well, yeah, we killed 3 or 4 guys. We're pretty sure they were small farmers, small ranchers. And, then they get their pay.
It's the Wild West, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. Next thing that I've got a little bit of background on, and this is actually where one of our cowboys actually has a brush with celebrity at the time, and that's Jasper Holtz. In April of 1886, there's this famous incident with Teddy Roosevelt. And as a lot of people know out this way, Teddy Roosevelt did come out to North Dakota in the 1880s, spent time out here, became a bit of a cattleman himself, did pretty good for the first year or so, then he got hit really, really hard on a bad winter. But one of the most famous incidents is in April of 1886. Roosevelt comes back to his Elkhorn ranch and finds that his boat that they used to go on the Little Missouri has been stolen. And he and his two fellows who work his ranch for him found themselves another boat and pursued these guys. And it turns out it was 3 tough cases who had stolen Roosevelt's boat. And they kind of catch up with them and take them unawares at their campsite and capture them. Now, Roosevelt is going to take them and turn them into the closest local sheriff, which is the sheriff in Dickinson, Stark County's sheriff at that time. So it's a fairly arduous trip back. He eventually gets to a ranch and borrows a wagon and also a driver for the wagon, and takes the 3 men in the wagon down to Dickinson to turn them in. The ranch he stops at is reportedly the Diamond Sea Ranch, which still exists in one way, shape, or form today, is my understanding, but had at least a long history in our area.
That means volume loud.
Oh, I'm really sorry. Well, you work in TV, I work in history. When somebody goes like this, I'm like, oh, am I not tall enough?
I just made that up.
I guess you had me on. Oh, so Roosevelt stops at the Diamond Sea Ranch. Some people say it's a guy's named Mason's Ranch, and other people say it's Jap Holtz's ranch that he stops at and borrows this wagon from. That story comes to us from, again, Dr. Stickney. Roosevelt, when he's bringing the guys down here to Dickinson to turn them into the sheriff, actually walks behind the wagon, because otherwise he doesn't feel that he's going to be able to keep track of these guys and they're going to get away on him. And walks along, and it's a couple of 3 days until they get there. Roosevelt barely sleeps, is the way the story goes, during this walk down to Dickinson, just because he doesn't want these guys to jump him and take off. Keeps himself awake part of the time by reading Anna Karenina, which Teddy always had a book with him. He either had a book with him or he was writing one. So he had Anna Karenina with him, and some other things to read as he moved along. And gets down to Dickinson, turns the 3 guys into the sheriff, and they eventually actually gets into the penitentiary. One of the guys at least gets about a year out of it, if I remember correctly. But after he does that, he's on the street, and he sees a guy, and he goes, "Can you tell me where I can find a doctor?" And it's Dr. Stickney he talks to. Dr. Stickney says, "Well, I can take care of you." And Roosevelt's feet were badly blistered and what have you. So he took him to his office and treated him. And that's where he got the story about what happened. And found out that the wagon was borrowed from Jap Holtz, supposedly. So this is our one Cowboys brush with celebrity. And also Dr. Stickney meeting Roosevelt at that time, goes home and he mentions it to his wife. And Roosevelt is not a really well-known politician or anything at this time. He's this Easterner who's given cattle ranching a shot. But he goes home and he talks to his wife about Roosevelt and about how impressed he is with him and what a really interesting fellow he is. And I get the feeling that's where the idea kind of grew from, to invite Roosevelt later in July to come and give the 4th of July address here in Dickinson, which of course is another famous incident. So that's Jap Holtz's brief brush with celebrity in 1886. The only other thing I can mention prior to 1888, when we get close to the incident, is initially it seemed kind of strange that we found Jasper Holtz in the Dakota Territorial Census, but did not find Frank Chase. Well, then we found a couple of newspaper mentions. Frank Chase spent some time up in Canada working for the Canadian Army as a scout in 1885, probably March through June, as a scout during what was called Reel's Rebellion. It was a rebellion of primarily Métis people against the government. And so that's probably why we don't have any census information about Frank Chase, unfortunately. But I did think it was kind of interesting that he'd take a job like that. I wondered if he had any real Canadian ties. I really couldn't find that.
So does that make him a bit of a drifter? I mean, and that was after he was the cowboy on the Schiefer Ranch with Holtz.
Yeah. So
So they worked together on the Schiefer Ranch, and then he went up to Canada for a while.
He was in Canada for a while. So yeah, maybe he does drift around a little bit. He's not married at this time. And he's a young guy, so he's 28 in 85. So, yeah, I guess you could say drifter is one way to look at it. He's probably lucky he didn't get picked up by another vigilante group riding around. But time in the Canadian Army was kind of interesting. And that was from a couple of times it's mentioned in the local paper, the Dickinson Press.
So he was kind of like like a lot of the cowboys you see in the films, you know, they arrive in town, they look for work, or they, you know, they're not always doing the same thing.
Exactly. That's the feel I got from it as well. That brings us to a little closer to our incident. We really don't have anything from 1887, not much more from 86, because unfortunately that is 1 year that's missing from the run of the Dickinson Press that's available online. Whatever reason that's for, it's really frustrating because, of course, it would also cover the 4th of July address that Roosevelt gives and what have you, and all those festivities. But we do know in 1888, early in the year, Holtz comes back down to Dickinson from his ranch in Dunn County, or I should say in the Kildare Mountain area. And again, as you asked before, they'd say it's about 50 miles away. Took him 7 days to get here. And the reason why is because of the snow, and he had remarked when he got into town to the newspaper guys that it was probably more snow than he'd ever seen in his life. And again, you know, he's almost 50 years old at this time, so he's seen a few winters out here.
And was he down with his wife, or was he just...
Actually, he did come with his wife and his wife's sister. They came along with him. But we don't know the sister's name, so we don't know the wife's maiden name. All we know is it's Kate and she's Irish. So, then in April, Chase and Holtz, and earlier in the month, are both in town, probably not concurrently, but maybe. But certainly by the night of April 25th, they are both there and meet again. And this is where our incident comes in. The night of April 25th, 1888, sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., at Eva Graham's place, they run into each other. Eva Graham's place is...
maybe it's not the main street these days, you might say, but...
Well, certainly
historically.
Historically, in fact, historically, they don't use the term Main Street in the newspaper. Oftentimes, they'll refer to it as Front Street.
Should I bring up a Villard picture?
Sure, that would be great. This would be a good time.
That one good?
That's part of Villard.
This is part of Villard.
And if you go to the other, that's the long shot there. This is an early shot of Villard. And probably it's called Front Street because it fronts on the railroad line, the main railroad line, which still goes through basically the same area here in Dickinson today. And like all towns, virtually all towns in our region at this time period, the first constructions are wood. I would say in about 10 to 12 years, they'll start to go over to more brick buildings, and then eventually, once Dickinson becomes a city, it actually has a designated fire zone where anytime a new building goes up or you replace an existing frame structure, it has to be brick. So, but this, if you see pictures of Dickinson and you see wood frame buildings, you know you're going to be looking at the 1880s or maybe part of the 1890s.
So this picture is probably around about the time then.
Yes, this should be round about the time. I have a sneaking suspicion that the coffee house building actually becomes McGillivray's later. It's kind of, they both have similarities to the facade.
Would you like the picture, the other picture, that one?
Yeah. So this is the McGillivray corner here, which is now the brick house, built as the Walton block.
So the Brick House Grill is a restaurant.
Yes,
Is a
that's
restaurant
right.
in town.
And that is the site of McGillivrays general store at the time that we're talking about, 1888. But somewhere on Villard, and of course this is several years later, this is about 1904 or so, or 1914, I can't recall. Maybe it's 14. No, it's going to be 1904. Somewhere along Villard is Eva Ray's place. Eva Graham. Eva Graham's place is what we'll call a house of ill repute. She delicately refers to it as a ladies' boarding house, but that ain't what's going on there. The fellas simply call it Eva Ray's place, and I'm assuming that maybe Ray is, maybe she's married and Ray is her maiden name, we don't know. And maybe her name's not Eva. Maybe it never was. Because we have a hard time finding any type of trace of her except through the newspaper, and usually because there's some kind of trouble. And certainly one of the first times that her place is listed in the Dickinson press is the night, is the account of the night of April 25th, 1888. So sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., Jasper Holtz comes into Eva Ray's place, Eva Graham's house of ill repute, and Frank Chase is already there. And Holtz saunters in, and it's been rumored, and it's mentioned in these accounts that there's some kind of long-standing feud between these two guys.
Despite the fact that Chase saved his life when they were working on the Sheaffer Ranch.
Exactly right. Yeah. Chase saved his life by lying his butt off. But something happened sometime, and there's some bad blood and apparently some incidents between them. So Holtz comes in and he sees Frank Chase there, and very soon they, quote, had a difficulty. And the quotes that I'll be using as I go through here are actually from the Dickinson Press's account from the coroner's inquest. So anything like that I quote, that's my source there. So they had a difficulty. Holtz himself, who's married to Kate, his Irish bride,
came to town with his wife and his wife's sister, but still goes to the house of ill repute. Yeah.
Well, they came early in April. This is late in April.
Oh.
Maybe he sent her back. I don't know. We really don't know. But he's obviously not a stranger to Eva Graham's place, because Hattie Setter, who is one of Eva's girls, makes some kind of disparaging remark about Holtz's wife, which results in Holtz being offended and putting Hattie on the floor in a somewhat ungentlemanly manner. When he does that, Chase steps forward and interferes.
That's a nice way of saying he shoved her over.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Chase steps forward and he takes Hattie's part, and Holtz says that he could slap the girl's mouth or any damn son of a bitch who upheld her, end quote. When he says that, Eva, who is there trying obviously to calm the situation down, she takes hold of Holtz by the arm to hold him back, and he turns to her and he says, "Don't monkey with me. I'm a bad man and you don't know me." Ooh, nasty. So when that happens, everybody kind of takes a step back, and Eva and a patron named Davis Breeding try to persuade Holtz to go with a guy named John Close to Lish's Saloon, L-I-S-H', owned by Frank Lish. Now, John Close works there, and I love this. This comes directly from the Dickinson Press. He works at Lish's Saloon as a, quote, dispenser of liquid exhilaration. I like that as a job title. I think I could really get into being a dispenser of liquid exhilaration. So Close who's there at Eva's, tries to persuade Holtz to come along with him, and he doesn't. He refuses to go. Unless Chase comes along. Holtz wants this guy he's angry with to come with him. Holtz refuses to go to Lish's unless, I'm sorry, Chase refuses to go along to Lish's bar unless Holtz stays. At this point, Holtz tells Chase, quote, that he had whipped him once and he could again. To which Chase replies, quote, I know you did and can again, and I don't want to fuss with you. Chase then actually gets up and goes into one of the bedrooms in Eva's place, searching for a revolver, but he doesn't find one. Now, this is a point where John Close, this fellow who works at Lish's Saloon, basically leads the way out of Eva's, taking Chase and this other bystander, Davis Breeding, with him. Holtz comes after him and catches up with the men, and he goes up to Chase and he declares, quote, Frank, I'm going to thump you. And then he called him a coward for having gone looking for a gun. At this point, Holtz draws his double-action Smith & Wesson 38 caliber model pistol, and he turns it butt first to Chase, and he says, take this and use it if you can. Chase takes the gun, but he gives it back to Holtz, saying he didn't want the gun as it would leave Holtz with none. No fair fight, right? So,
what's the difference in age between these guys again?
28 and 45.
28 and 45.
Yeah. And the 45-year-old guy thumped Frank Chase
before,
at least once before, and he will do it again. So Chase takes the gun from Holtz, but then he turns it back to him, and he said he didn't want the gun as it would leave Holtz with none, and Holtz replied that he could give Chase the revolver and still lick him. And then at that point, their exchange, according to the testimony, their voices dropped kind of low, and it's hard to hear what they're saying. But John Close did hear Holtz say that, quote, he had the revolver against Frank's breast. I'm sorry, Frank's heart. But Chase's response, he couldn't hear. And then Holtz comes back and has kind of the last word at this point, saying he would not shoot Frank unless Chase got a gun for himself. This is where the encounter breaks off and the men disperse for some time. Chase and Breeding, they move off together. They stop in at Brown's Saloon, where he unsuccessfully asks to borrow a revolver, as he said he, quote, wanted a gun very badly. So, failing at the Brown Saloon to get a gun, then he goes to Lish's Saloon, where they had been supposed to be going in the first place. And there he sees John Close again, and he asks if he could have a gun from the saloon, but Close won't give him one. Chase then remarked that he'd go to bed if he had a revolver for protection, and then he persuades Davis Breeding to sell him a 45 caliber Colt 6 shooter there on the street in front of Lish's Saloon for reportedly $10. And at that time, he promises both Breeding and John Close that there was not going to be any trouble. Now, John Close sounds like a pretty reasonable guy in some ways. He thinks there's going to be real trouble. And he decides he's going to go head to the courthouse and get the sheriff. So he heads off to the courthouse, which is about 3 blocks different, the distance from where we're talking about. All these businesses are along the Lard someplace. You might want to bring up the map of the Lard. Now this is actually based on an 1898 Sanborn fire insurance map. Any of the structures that you see in yellow, those are, at that time, wood frame, and there's only 2 brick buildings in place. In fact, actually, this is the first brick building, the bank building site, which is going to be mentioned in a little bit, on the corner of Barnes and Barnes and Villard, which would now be First Avenue West, that right? Yes. Yes, First Avenue West. A couple of other places to just mention because they're going to come up here pretty soon. Billy Walton's Saloon, St. Paul Hotel. This becomes the First National Bank. Originally it's the Stark County Bank. The Villard House, often referred to here, is going to be down in this area. That's a hotel. And then McGillivray store down at the corner, which matches up with that photo we showed before. So now I can just figure out where I was. So Frank Chase has bought a gun from Davis Breeding, and he asked Breeding at that time, and he's like, oh shoot, I forgot. Can you go back to Eva Ray's and get my jacket and my vest? They got out of there so fast the guy didn't even grab his coat. So Chase says, yeah, he'll go. And when he leaves, Breeding leaves, Chase stays there. They're in the vicinity of McGillivray's, that corner right there. And when he leaves, Breeding says, Frank Chase is waiting. He sits down on a barrel along the side, the east side of the building on what is Sims Street. Now when this is happening, two of Eva Ray's other patrons who had seen the earlier exchange at her place, a guy named John Porter and another named John Hammock, they're in Walton's Saloon, which is down over Billy Walton's Saloon, over there. And Jasper Holtz walks in. Apparently that must be his first stop right after Eva Ray's,
And this is like after 1 a.m.
Oh, we're getting probably the 2:15 area right now. The testimony's pretty sketchy about times. They talk about when things start, and they talk about when things end. How long things happen in between, given the nature of testimony in a coroner's inquest at that time, it's pretty sketchy. So we're probably, I'm guessing, maybe 2:15. Because these guys have been bar hopping, basically, a little bit. And because, I can't imagine any time that they're stopping at a bar and they ask if they can borrow a gun, that Frank Chase doesn't at least have a glass of beer. Anyway. So, John Porter and John Hammock are at Walton Saloon. Holtz comes in after leaving Eva's, and you get the feeling from the things that they talk about in their testimony, he must have still been running his mouth about Frank Chase. Because Hammock urges Holtz to bed down at the saloon. And apparently this was not uncommon at the time. These guys from out of town, if they weren't going to spend money on a real room at one of the hotels, that they'd bed down on the floor or maybe on the pool table at the saloon. And this is what John Hammock said he was going to do anyway.
I play pool. I hate people who even touch a pool table.
Oh, no kidding.
That would
It's
make
just
me really
wrong.
mad.
It's just wrong. But he tries to convince Jasper Holtz to bed down there at the saloon. He's like, I'm going to be here, stay here. We'll deal with Frank. You can deal with Frank Chase in the morning. Because he just wants to put things off. Get the idea that maybe Jasper's got a little bit of a load on, maybe. There's conflicting testimony about that. But he wants to calm the situation down. Nobody wants to see anybody get hurt. But Jasper, he refuses this suggestion. And this is about, by the time we get to this, it's about 2:45. So Jasper Holtz leaves Walton Saloon, and when he does, he notices David Breeding pass the saloon with Chase's coat and vest, which says to me, if Walton's is here and Breeding is going past it, and we know he's going back to Frank Chase down at McGillivray's corner, Eva's place must be somewhere down here. And just the fact that there's nothing here in 1898 does not mean there wouldn't have been something there 10 years before. You get the odd fire every once in a while, a little urban renewal happens. But somewhere down along this line, because we know Eva's place, she says it's on Villard. Could theoretically be across the street, but that's basically railroad buildings at that time. So somewhere down this way. Breeding goes past with the coat and the vest. I guess I'll just assume that Jasper recognizes the coat, figures he knows where Breeding's going, and follows him. About this same time, John Close, who had been worried enough to go seeking the sheriff, suddenly decides, as he's on his way to the courthouse, he's getting real close to the courthouse, he decides not to. Doesn't say why in his testimony, but he's just, I changed my mind. And so he turns back and he goes to go to his room, which from his discussion of hearing things and what have you, probably was at the St. Paul Hotel. So he goes back to his room, and he's just got to his room next at the St. Paul, next to Walton's Saloon, and he hears shots. He leaves his room to investigate, gets out on the street, and there's John Hammock and John Porter, who had been at Walton's, out on the street near the bank construction site, at the corner of Barnes and Villard, and they tell him that there's a man down near McGillivray corners. So all three of them start to proceed directly east on Villard towards that site. I want to make sure I get my sequence and everything down here. So they go to McGillivray corner, they come around the corner, and there is a body there laying in the street. Bending down to check for a pulse, John Close quickly concludes that the man lying there was indeed dead, and it was indeed Jasper Holtz. John Hammock, who's with him, he sees Frank Chase and Davis Breeding on Villard Street. Chase asks Hammock and Breeding, he says, guys, I want you to come along with me. I'm going to go to the sheriff. I'm going to go turn myself in. They didn't suggest it. Their testimony says it was his idea to do that. So they go off. Not too far away, just the next block up. Actually, this is a half block. So the next block, which would be Sims and First Street East, no, First Street West, where the dental clinic is now downtown, used to be the Woolworths. That's where Dr. Stickney's house was. Dr. McDonald must have been living someplace close by as well. Here it is, it's almost 3 o'clock in the morning. They hear the shots, and as Breeding and Hammock are leaving with Frank Chase to go with him to the courthouse, the two doctors come down to see what it's about, and they make an examination right away. They arrived at the scene, they examined Holtz, and they confirmed that his death resulted from a gunshot wound to the head. The shot striking midway between his right eye and mouth, traveling left and downward, exiting at the back of the skull. Examination of the weapons revealed that Holtz's revolver had 4 empty chambers. Chase's Colt still held 5 shells. Dr. McDonald reported hearing 2 shots and then 2 or 3 more. A Mrs. Thompson, who lived by, basically confirmed that, adding that between the 2 shot groupings, she heard someone exclaim, "Take that, damn you!" Breeding is the only eyewitness to the actual shooting. He said he'd been looking around the corner, the McGillivray corner, from the Villard Street side, and he saw the 2 men exchange words, which he doesn't quote in his testimony. Maybe he was too far away to hear, don't know. But when they fought, he said they were about 25 feet apart. As they got ready to shoot, Chase took a step back before the firing commenced. Holtz firing 2 or 3 shots, and Chase just the one, which was the last shot. After Chase, Breeding, and Hammock left for the courthouse, it's assumed that this is when the doctors did something which I think is really interesting for a couple of reasons. I'm assuming it's the doctors. They've confirmed that Holtz is dead. They don't move him. They get somebody to bring over a wagon box, and if you want to show what a wagon box looks like, you can bring up that photo. There we are. This actually is a wagon box in front of the first City Hall / Fire Department in Dickinson. That building's built in 1899, 1900, but certainly a wagon box looks the same regardless of the time period. What they did is, and again, I really believe it was the doctors, because it had to be somebody who had something on the ball. They got a wagon box, brought it over by Holtz's body, and then turned it upside down to cover the body. And two reasons for this. One, I think, which is pretty forward thinking, is that they're basically kind of preserving the crime scene. But the other thing they're doing, and this is stated in a couple of accounts of this incident, is that one of the reasons they put the wagon box over Holtz's body was to protect it from the curious, which would have included hogs that would be typically at large in the town, and which might disturb the corpse, to put it delicately.
So this is an image of a whole bunch of wild hogs in a town, not this town, but
And not uncommon for livestock to wander freely in the late 19th century. Dickinson is a town at this time, and they really don't have the mechanism to pass ordinances. They can't do that until they become a village, and that doesn't happen until 1899. 6 months later, they actually decide to become a city. And probably some of the most important things that happen right away is they start to pass these ordinances. And one of the early ones is about livestock at large. And if you go through, especially a couple of the early fire insurance maps, 1898, 1904, you'll see several houses in town that will have not just carriage houses behind, but they'll actually have barns as well. And it's not uncommon for people to have a milk cow, maybe a pig or two, what have you, chickens certainly. Well, not uncommon in town for that. And people weren't necessarily really rigid on keeping them pinned up.
but pigs will eat anything as well.
Exactly, we know that from watching Deadwood, right?
I was reading something else recently about pigs eating anything. I can't remember what it was though, so that was a rather pointless anecdote, but they are.
Yeah, they'll eat just about anything. I mean, we talk about goats that way, but yeah, pigs apparently are very adaptable. So they put the wagon box over basically to preserve the crime scene and also to protect the body, which is important because the next day our Stark County coroner arrives on the noon train from Richardton and impanels a jury, a coroner's inquest jury, which consisted of a gentleman named William Moore, a guy named A.C. McGillivray, whose name actually is given to this incident because it happens right by his store at that corner, and another guy named John Vinton. They are the jury, and they take testimony that covers the details we've been talking about, calling 10 witnesses, starting at noon the day after the 26th, and actually re-examining a couple of those witnesses on the 27th as well, which incidentally is the day that Jasper Holtz is buried, although where, I'm not exactly sure. I'm assuming he's married a Catholic, or an Irish girl who's probably Catholic. Maybe he has a burial associated somehow with St. Patrick's, but certainly 1888 is just when the Dickinson Cemetery Association itself is chartered, just about this time too, so that cemetery is not organized, and there's there's only 1 or 2 1888 burials that I found in it, none of them as early as April. So, could be he lies in St. Patrick's Cemetery unmarked, we don't know. But he was very,
Something people might find when they're digging their gardens this spring.
Could well be, you might come across Jasper Holtz, it's true. One of the interesting things that come out of the coroner's inquest, number one, it's a jumble. What I found, the first time I went through this whole thing, it was really confusing, and it's just barely not getting confusing now, because the coroner just simply calls people. He isn't like a prosecutor who's reviewed evidence, taken witness statements and things like that, and built a chronological case. The coroner's, the testimony he takes is really a scattershot of what's gone on. And, to try to put all that back together was real interesting in this case. But one of the things that it helps us a lot on here is that at the very least in legal procedures at this time, they do allow Frank Chase to make a statement. He's not sworn as a witness, but he can make a statement, and that we do have. And I'd like to just quote that. And the first thing that happens is there's a discrepancy with one of the other witnesses. Quote, I told Breeding I would give him $20 for his gun. Well, Breeding says he only got $10. I don't know if he's trying to cheap out or what there, but so I told Breeding I would give him $20 for his gun, and he said if I would give my word and honor that I would go to bed, he would let me have it. I sat down on a barrel waiting for Breeding to bring my coat and vest. After he returned, I bade him good night and was going the back way to Kleinfelter's, which Kleinfelter's was the Villard house. Kleinfelter was the hotel keeper there. And he was going to go the back way to Kleinfelter, specifically, as he says, to avoid Front Street, Villard. He didn't want to run into Jasper Holtz. Whether Breeding spoke and says, look out, or Holtz says, shoot, I don't know, but at that instant, Holtz fired. Breeding's testimony makes it sound like they had some exchange between Holtz and Chase, and then set themselves a goodly distance, 25 feet apart, before the firing started. Chase's testimony, or I should say his statement, makes it sound like it happened boom, boom, boom. So, I don't know, but at that instant, Holtz fired. He was on the sidewalk and fired 2 shots when I pulled my 6-shooter and failed to go off. Then we fired at the same time and Holtz fell. There were 4 shots fired. This is a curious statement. There were 4 shots fired, and I thought one struck my ear. My aside to this is I think I'd be pretty certain if I was hit in the ear. I digress. Chase continues on. I stood for a half of a minute after he fell. Breeding was the first man I saw, and I asked him if he supposed, had I killed Holtz? And he said he thought I had, and I asked him to go with me to give myself up. We went to the jail and gave myself up to Deputy Sheriff Grucius and told him what I had done. Chase added that he wasn't intoxicated as he had only been drinking beer. And, quote, he did not think Holtz was very full. And that was the end of the statement.
So what does he mean by very full? He didn't think Holtz was very drunk?
That's the way I take it.
Okay.
That's the way I take it. So the jury considers the testimony they heard, they consider Frank Chase's statement, and they come back with their verdict. Said jurors, this is a quote, said jurors upon their oath do say that about the hour of 3 a.m. of April 25, 1888, by the means of a pistol shot discharged from a pistol in the hands of Frank Chase, the said Jasper Holtz came to his death feloniously. We further believe Davis Breeding to be an accessory to the crime for maliciously selling the pistol to Frank Chase while in an excited state of mind. So, on that recommendation, they're put into jail and bail is set. Now, word of this shooting affray, that's how it seems to go out in all the articles that pick it up, goes out via newspapers. I found it as far away as New Ulm, Minnesota, was carried the story. And they all basically say the same thing in their reports, although New Ulm Weekly somehow gets a hold of some extra information and adds that both men had been drinking and playing poker all night, with Holtz losing heavily. Well, there's no mention in any of the testimony that they actually have been playing cards together any place. And it seems by the way things are in the account that they first saw each other that night at Eva Grant's house between midnight and 1 a.m. So,
And it's not a problem with playing cards? I mean,
I don't think so.
it's not like illegal in city limits or anything they don't want to.
Oh gosh, no, that was absolutely allowed, no problem. It's a pretty wide open town in some ways. I mean, Eva's working, the girls are working. There's 5 saloons in town. Town of, is there maybe 600 or 700 people by this time? 5 saloons and
I've
3
lived in
churches.
towns like that.
Yeah, exactly. Little town near where I grew up had 200 people and 7 bars. What are you gonna do? Well, big rural.
Open a bar.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
obviously a good market.
It was a good work. I think it still is. Anyway, Chase and Breeding, their attorney is a guy named Alexander Hughes. He changes a change of venue from Dickinson to Gladstone. They don't say why exactly, but apparently they didn't feel they were going to get a fair shake at Dickinson, or maybe they were afraid that the feeling might run against Chase. Don't know. We don't know how popular Jasper Holtz was. Have no idea. But they asked for a change of venue, and so they go to Gladstone, and Justice Bissell. They appear before him, and he binds both men over for a grand jury appearance. Bail is fixed at $1,000 for Chase and $750 for Breeding, and witnesses were also held under $200 bonds, held to appear. And this is real important at this time period. You'll see reports of circuit court cases of serious crimes, assault and what have you, come up at the term of court. And this is literally circuit court. The court, the judge and his clerk and such, go from place to place on a circuit. They ride a circuit and hold court. So what this oftentimes means is that you might be arrested for a crime in April, but maybe you don't come forth to the circuit court and appear before the grand jury for several months. One of the reasons a lot of cases are dismissed is witnesses just disappear. It's a very transient population out on, quote unquote, the frontier at that time. Cowboys, they can't afford to stay in one place at one time. They've got to get back to the ranch they're working on, or maybe somebody takes an opportunity like Frank Chase did, and he goes and works for the Canadian Army for a couple of months. So it's really not unusual for cases to come for trial or for a grand jury appearance, and they're dismissed for lack of any witnesses. And so they get to the habit of starting to have witnesses put up a bond. Now, doesn't mean everybody's paying out cash right away. There are bondsmen, what we call bail bondsmen today, at work, even on the frontier at this time. And within a week, Chase secures a bond, and a bond usually, just like it is today, it's usually a percentage of what is set by the court. Maybe it's 10% or something, who knows. But Chase, has a $1,000 bond. He gets a bondsman to put forth the bond for him, and so he gets out fairly quickly. Breeding apparently doesn't have the means to do that, and he's a guest at the sheriff for nearly a month before he's able to secure a bond. So what do these guys do when they get out? Well, it's really interesting. They show up in the paper next, just a couple of months later, in July, July 4th actually. The 4th of July activities is where we find Breeding and Chase. They ride horses in the local horse races for the 4th of July, which is a pretty typical activity at that time. Breeding rides a horse named Trixie, and Chase was aboard Bay Billy, in the quarter-mile race. Neither one of them placed in that. But Chase also rode Bay Billy in the 200-yard contest, taking a $10 first prize. So he had a good 4th of July, I guess. But racing success notwithstanding, the next month finds Chase before the Dickinson Justice Campbell, where he's fined, ironically, $10 in costs for disturbing the peace. Doesn't say what he did, but obviously he stepped out of line somehow here in Dickinson. And this made his bondsman, the guy who put forward money on his bail, makes his bondsman nervous enough that he revokes his bond, which sends Chase back to jail, where we have to assume he stays until the grand jury was impaneled in January of 1889. The work of the grand jury actually is taken care of very, very quickly. January 12th, the press applauds the dismissal of the Chase homicide charge, it generally being felt that Chase acted in self-defense. This is where one of those frustrations kind of comes in, when you start to buy into what happened. You have just the testimony from the inquest, and it's not of the really probing nature that we're used to, at least in our experience of what we observe in criminal courts today. And you almost wish they would have indicted Frank Chase, just so you could have gotten more details on it. But of course, Frank Chase doesn't want to take that chance, and he's happy to have the charges dropped. Interestingly enough, they do not drop the charges against Davis Breeding, but they changed them. Since Chase isn't charged with homicide, they can't charge Breeding with being an accessory to homicide. So they decide to charge him with carrying a concealed weapon.
Because he concealed it on Chase?
We don't find that out, and here's the reason why. And it's also, this explains why they lodged this charge and leave it lodged. So, Breeding, he eventually made bail, but his bondsman got nervous, and he revoked Breeding's bond. So Breeding had to go back to jail and wait for the grand jury. Part of the process for that, which probably was involved with some kind of court motion for him to be held over for the grand jury, involved him being taken by the sheriff to appear before a judge in Bismarck. During that trip on the train, Davis Breeding took off for parts unknown. So he's a fugitive. And the reason they charged him in absentia when they indicted him, the grand jury, was basically to ensure that the charges would be against him, would not be vacated, and it would encourage him never to return to the area.
And this was the guy who sold the gun.
Right,
It's
for
not
either
like he
$10
really
or $20.
did anything.
Yeah, exactly. For either $10 or $20, he sold this gun. Can't make bail right away. Spends a month in jail, and then takes off, and never seen again. Of course, you search for Davis Breeding. You hope to find something, a place he's buried, or maybe he shows up in a census or something like that. But he is just literally gone. But we don't even know if Davis Breeding was his real name or what the deal is. So he just kind of disappears. Now there are some, well, the last thing I gotta say on that is that the press did have something to say about Davis Breeding's escape. They said that the quote, the county was rather glad to be rid of him. So apparently he wasn't necessarily the most popular guy. Also, out of that court session at that time, Eva Graham was fined $75 for her guilty plea for keeping a house of ill fame. You have to assume it was the sheriff who probably leveled that charge. But I have to tell you, this is 1888. She shows up in, first place I found Eva Graham was with a house in Bismarck, doing the same type of trade. And she shows up through to 1896 in Dickinson. So even though she got fined, she stuck around and continued her entrepreneurial ways.
Probably improved Bismarck. I mean,
well, yeah, probably. A final note on this part of the story comes to us from a 1912 clipping from the Dickinson Press. An article entitled, "Holtz Shot 25 Years Ago." And it briefly recounts these melancholy events of the early morning of April 25th, 1888. And they cite a guy named Mr. LaBreche, who had bought the Holtz place after the shooting. And he tells the press what happened to Frank Chase after the grand jury refused to indict him. Sometimes afterward, Chase moved to Elk River, Minnesota, got married, and then sadly his mind, quote, became affected, and eventually was institutionalized in 1903, dying at the Hastings State Insane Asylum in Hastings, Minnesota in 1926. Now, is this the type of thing that happens all the time in Dickinson? Not really. But 1888, there was one other incident that had people somewhat concerned. Most of the crime you read about would be property crimes, burglaries, maybe some vandalism, something along those lines, a bit of disturbing the peace, but nothing of a real terrible nature all the time. But in September, after the Holtz shooting, an incident in what they call Dickinson's West End, which today would probably be close to 3rd Avenue West, kind of ticked off the editor of the press. It seems a German immigrant named Ludwig Weiss was rumored to be running his own house of ill fame from his family's home. One newspaper report indicating that it was actually Mrs. Weiss who was doing the entertaining. This enterprise apparently raised the ire of some of the locals as a party of men surrounded the house on a Sunday night, and they attempted to tar and feather Ludwig Weiss.
And yet, these days, the city is much more supportive of enterprising startups.
Exactly.
Small business.
Yeah.
This guy was...
Yeah, well... So they wanted to tar and feather Ludwig Weiss. Weiss does get away, but they did succeed in getting a little bit on his face, apparently. And this incident frightened Weiss enough that he bought himself a revolver. Also happened to have a shotgun. The next Friday, a 25-year-old guy named John Sweeney from St. Paul rode his horse up to Weiss's house and called Weiss to the door. And this is from the initial account from the Dickinson Press. And it's unclear if Sweeney had a problem with the establishment or if he was there as a customer. Regardless, Weiss claimed that he was afraid that Sweeney was there to do him harm and was afraid of being shot. And he thought that Sweeney had a revolver in his hand. Did he or did he not? It's never said. Weiss fired at Sweeney with a shotgun, and he misses. But then he pulls the revolver and shot Sweeney in the left leg below his thigh, shatters the bone, and he knocks Sweeney out of the saddle. Now, I've shot both, and I think I could hit something with a shotgun before I could hit something.
So he shot the guy in the leg while he was on a horse?
That's what this first account
But he
said.
missed with the shotgun.
Exactly.
Did he not hit the horse?
Doesn't
That's
say.
a hell of a miss.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
couldn't hit a horse with a shotgun at 6 feet.
Well, Ludwig, he was probably still a little nervous about that whole tar and feather thing, I guess. I don't know. There are some things that are problematic with this account from the press, but the fact that Sweeney was badly injured was not in dispute. Weiss immediately gives himself up and he gets thrown into jail. Again, doctors McDonald and Stickney examine the wound. They pronounce the wound to be very dangerous. Sweeney refuses amputation of the leg, the ball being lodged in his leg, although the doctors say they can't find it. And the next day, at Sweeney's decision, he's placed on an eastbound train to go back home to St. Paul. The end of that report has an editorial comment from the editor of the Dickinson Press that reads, "It is a fact that every shooting, scrape, and row occurring here this summer originated or was directly traceable to the houses of ill fame, which are entirely too numerous, and so long as they are tolerated, we may expect trouble. If this thing continues, the good name of the town will be a thing of the past, and instead of the fair reputation we now enjoy, our town will be pointed out by strangers as a hard place." Can't find what happened to John Sweeney. We don't know if he died, we don't know if they cut off his leg, whatever happened. But Ludwig Weiss did appear before Judge Campbell, and he was released. Despite the contradictions and the weird circumstances from that initial account, the testimony that is brought into the case before Judge Campbell, which is not recounted, apparently supports a contention of Weiss that he acted in self-defense, and he was released.
I hope the horse was okay.
Me too. You know, we don't know what the horse's name was. Oftentimes we don't. They're the sad victims of oftentimes frontier violence, but so it goes. The last thing I have, which I haven't been able to verify, it comes from a 1941 article. There was a series in the Dickinson Press that year called Interesting Personalities. And they got a hold of a lot of the old timers in town and asked them about their experiences here and what have you. And there was a lady named Christina Plagelmeyer who they talked to. And she does mention the gunfight in which Holtz is killed. And she actually is one source that confirms that a wagon box was placed over the body until the coroner came. But what I found interesting was that the next statement in that article, she said, the next year, the Cowboys had to put up their guns as soon as they came into town, so there was less trouble shipping time.
What's shipping time?
Well, that gave me pause, because I found serious shipping happening in October, not April, but I'll have to confess, I would have to go into other years to see when the herds were really coming in. Maybe one of our viewers might know a little bit more about that. But that is the story of the Cowboy shooting at McGillivray Corner.
And the horse shooting.
And the horse shooting somewhere on Dickinson's west end. Yes, yes. There was mention the next year of a community meeting down on the south side where the subject was the houses of ill fame on the south side and what to do about them, but no report about what exactly was decided. And I know as late as 1910, there is still an active house of prostitution in town. Interestingly enough, 1900, there are two houses of prostitution side by side in the south side of town, where we know the ladies there are prostitutes because we find them charged in the Justice of the Peace dockets. Although the madam lists her occupation as landlord, and each one of the ladies is a boarder. 1910, the one house of prostitution in town, I believe it was Kate Roberts' place, everybody lists their profession as prostitute. What are you going to do?
What a place to leave the story. Yeah, well,
everybody's going to go run to the website familysearch.org and see if they can track down the federal census. Yeah.
And then, well, that's the sort of thing you come across, right? I mean, I still find it quite surprising. Holtz was in town and he goes to one of these places. I guess he probably wasn't with his sister-in-law at the time.
Yeah, probably not. But obviously, Hattie Sutter, the girl who worked for Eva Graham, knew his wife because she said disparaging things about her. It's kind of intriguing.
Her only claim to fame.
Yeah. Can't find trace of Hattie after that. Of course, maybe her name wasn't Hattie.
But I think it really, in a small way, it shows these kinds of things. I mean, I guess fairly common across towns of this size in the old West. Is that the right term?
I think so. I think
It's
so.
all very new for me. It's like
Oh, because there's no
the
prostitution.
1880s.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I watched the TV show Deadwood fairly recently, and the idea that Dickinson had a similar background, obviously not quite as much money flowing through from the gold and silver mines and things like that, but I don't know, I think it's kind of interesting that these sorts of things were something that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you shouldn't be hanging around downtown at 2 a.m.
Oh, that's true as well. There's no curfew, obviously. I believe there's a town constable at this time. You see mention of one from time to time, but they don't really have a police force, and it's only a couple of officers until they actually organize as a city. And then things get a little bit more formal. But again, the city is 1900, and we know 1910 there's still a House of Prostitution Act. What we found out there, I mean, and it's one of the ordinances that's passed, is that, you can't keep a house in ill fame, and they lay out the fines. What I found going through the Justice of the Peace dockets was that every month they would go, that is the police magistrate, would go to the House of Prostitution and basically arrest everybody. And the woman who kept the house, I believe, was a $25 fine, and there was $5 for each one of the ladies. And they did this every month. They didn't put them out of business. Basically, it was almost treated like a business tax. And what did in the last House of Prostitution that I have evidence for, Kate Roberts' place, was not what they were doing in terms of prostitution, but the fact that they were serving liquor. Because shortly after statehood, North Dakota goes dry. And blind pigging, which is what they would call, what we would call in the 20s a speakeasy, they called a blind pig at that time. That is one...
Probably going to get you under less suspicion. I gotta go get a blind pig. Who doesn't?
Yeah, really.
That's what I'm going after this.
Yeah, but that's what gets an awful lot of attention is violations of the prohibition law in the state. Awful lot of prosecutions, an awful lot of people trying to make a buck.
Oh, we have a couple of questions come in. Chris Kruger says, what block of 3rd Avenue West would have been considered the western edge?
Well, when they say the western edge, I'm thinking they're talking about the vicinity of 3rd Avenue West.
She says, how far north? Just wondering how far north.
Oh, how far north it would have gone by that time? The original plat has 42 blocks in it, so that'll be 4 blocks west of Sims, 3 blocks west of Sims, and then 6 blocks more. That's the original plat. Yeah, so not too far up, and we're assuming that's the western edge, because we know that not too much further down from there is where the Dickinson farm is, and that's out in the country at that time, which is like, I think 7th Avenue West, somewhere in that area. I might have seen the reference. It's interesting when you start to look at how the town looks today compared to that initial plat, how much it's grown. And the old Centennial Roundup book, which was published in 82, actually has a nice little sequence on the growth of the town, talking about all the different additions that were added after the original plot, or plat, I should say. And the city of Dickinson grew pretty fast in terms of its space, and pretty steady for quite some time.
Well, I don't think we have any more questions.
Well, I sure hope people found this somewhat interesting, and at least somebody stayed with us till the end.
Yeah, we've got a few people watching. And hopefully people might stream it or watch it later.
So you will be putting this on our Facebook page, a link there?
Well, it's directly streamable on Facebook
Okay,
the second I switch off the live.
wonderful.
And I think we don't have a YouTube page, but I can put it on my own YouTube page, but I don't have anything really on there. There's a picture of there's a video of some badges, and a couple of videos from the paleo side.
Perfect.
But we'll make it available through those sorts of things. I think it's been an interesting experiment. I think
I enjoyed putting it all together quite a bit. I thought the format was a lot of fun, just chatting along. Can't believe we talked for an hour and a half. This is the problem with me. It can be verbose.
I think didn't you say you had like 4 or 5 cases of
I
different
do have
things?
some others. I do have some others that I think could be of interest. Various. Some of them are deaths. Some of them are related to some other types of cases, and I'd like to try to put some of those together and do this some more.
Yeah, I think there's an oral history of Dickinson, and I think of the kind of an interesting case, and maybe I can work on getting the images a little bit more accessible for that sort of thing. But I hope people learned a little something about the town,
And I hope people avail themselves of some of the materials that are available readily to them, especially given our situations now where a lot of us are sitting at home. We're not here at the museum because, we're just that dedicated. No, we are. We're very fortunate. We are closed here, but we are working through this time. The winter time is usually pretty quiet for us, but Paleo's working hard, prepping fossils and planning for a field season this summer. And then on the history side, we're working through our photo collection and researching things like this story. But with people having time on their hands now, again, it's through the Library of Congress, the Chronicling America project. Once you've kind of learned how to search through it and get an idea, it's pretty easy to use. You can specifically search the Dickinson Press and such. But also we found, particularly in North Dakota, it's good to search the entire state. Not every newspaper is there, but certainly there, the Medora newspaper, the Monmouth newspaper, the various ones out of Bismarck. And it's handy because one of the charms of North Dakota is that there aren't that many of us here. And when something happens in one town, everybody in every other town usually hears about it, even back then.
I think if it's something that's quite interesting too. I mean, the thing about this story is that it's not so much that it's salacious, although it obviously has its elements. It's, it really is a kind of little Wild West tale that's taking place in Dickinson. That there are so many of these towns that are railroad towns, and grain comes on, grain comes off, cow goes on, cow goes off. But there are things that are happening in the town, and it adds to the depth. It's not all just about the bad winter or the fire of a particular building. There's these human events that are occurring that I think are quite interesting.
It's the stories. It's the stories that really drive what we do here on the history side. Although you got some pretty cool stories in paleo too.
I hope so. Yeah. So I guess we don't have too much more to add. Maybe we put a few plugs in at the end of this if anybody's watching, but we have the historical image archive that you can go to our website and you can find hundreds, if not thousands, of historical images of Dickinson. That's something that's always going on at the museum, scanning this archive of photographs. We're very lucky to have it. Literally thousands of images of Dickinson going all 100 years.
Oh, yeah.
Back to the 1880s, some of them. So there's lots of images of Dickinson through time. And I found a few pictures of my house on there, and Rocky Butte near where I live, when all the trees were much smaller and things like that. It's pretty cool. So there's things like that to look at. And if people enjoyed this, we can look at doing another one.
Yeah, please let us know. We'd love some feedback.
Yeah, let us know what works, what doesn't work, what you'd like to change, how big of a microphone we should both wear. I want one of those ones that football players with massive headphones and a great big mic. I always think they look ridiculous. I can't believe anybody wears such a thing. It looks like you're back in the 1970s, but there you are. I'm sure we could find one for Bob.
That'd be wonderful.
Yes, other than that, if you have any other questions, we'll say they enjoyed it. Next time, have a couple of additional microphones.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
We'll get the helmets.
Yeah, we'll just make a phone.
There, okay.
Yeah. Great.
All right.
Thanks very much for tuning in.
We'd like to thank Joel and Laura for helping us out. They're from the museum board.
Yep.
Helping us with the technical side of things and not falling asleep on us, which is a great compliment. Laura, you awake over there?
I'm awake.
All right, great.
All right.
Well, thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, and bye-bye.